Morena. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Representation Review Subcommittee meeting. I'll ask Councillor Epiha to open us with karakia. Thank you. Are there any conflicts of interest? There are none. Confirmation of the minutes of the last meeting. Moved Mr. Morton, seconded Councillor Miller. Any discussion of those minutes?
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to commend the Council and the Committee for having the Treaty of Waitangi hung up in the chambers. That was part of the discussion from the last minute, so commend the Council on that. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no other discussion. All those in favour? Contrary, carried. Representation, timeline and program update. Stephen Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We presented the timeline which we've been working to, so we developed that late last year, and just wanted to bring an updated timeline to you. So we're keeping track of the progress of the work program as we work through this process, and really to highlight a couple of the target dates that we are now working towards as we're now getting to the stage of developing the scenarios that we want to present to our community for consultation. Just noting that we need to be working towards no later than the council meeting of the 28th of July for the council to adopt the initial proposal for consultation, so that we're ready to spend essentially the month of August engaging with the community about the proposals that we will be taking out. So the timeline following this meeting is that we do have another subcommittee in June, and at that point we need to be pretty close to having the initial proposal finalised, so we can then come back to the subcommittee in July to, I guess, ratify that initial proposal, and then take it to a council briefing, which would be on the 28th of July, so that we can brief the wider council on the proposal, and then have that endorsed and adopted for consultation on the 28th of July. So those are the key target dates that we're working towards at this stage.
Just either Stephen or the Chair, I guess in light of our last meeting, we went round and round circles a lot, and we weren't quite sure what we were trying to achieve. So if either the Chair or Stephen could give us an outcome this evening from today, whether it's a short list of maps or what you're seeking from us.
My hope, we'll receive the reports in front of us, and then we have the maps and some amended maps, but we can come down to a smaller number of maps for our next meeting. I would hope that we can weed out probably 50% of these maps for a variety of reasons, and then look at possible refinements of those that remain. There are a number of maps that I think have some issues with community of interest questions as we look at them, and the numbers could be played, the mesh blocks could be played with and see where they fall with the numbers. So I'd hope that we can come out of today's meeting with a smaller number of maps, 4 to 6 perhaps, that we want to further refine to bring back. I see that we've got 2 meetings scheduled for June. I'm not sure that we need both of them, but it's good to have them there in case we do. And then in July, we meet and have a workshop briefing with council to present our recommendation, our preferred option, and the other options that will go out for public consultation before it comes to council. I think it's important to give our fellow councillors an opportunity to see and discuss what we've done before we bring it to a council meeting, so that they are familiar with the process we've been through and where we've come and where we've got to. So that's my expectation, my hopes for today's meeting. Stephen, have you got any other comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the final report on today's agenda is really the substantive one, and the recommendation there is that we're asking the committee to give guidance to staff for further refinement of representation scenarios. So effectively, as you have suggested, it would be good if we could take away perhaps no more than 4 scenarios that we now work up for the finer detail. So a clear indication would be helpful, so that we can bring those back and work them into the final initial proposal. That'll be the substance of the third report on the agenda.
Any further discussion on the report with respect to timelines? If not, would someone like to move? Councillor Gallagher, seconded by Councillor Miller. All those in favour that we receive the report for information? Contrary? Carried. The report on pre-consultation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The second report is to bring to the public agenda the representation review pre-consultation research that has been undertaken. Members of the committee will be familiar with this research, having been through discussions and workshops to have a presentation and to consider the findings and the insights that the research has given to us, which are summarised in the report, and a copy of the research report is attached to the agenda. So this is really to make sure that we have this now recorded and available for members of the public to see the research that's gone in behind some of the thinking that we've undertaken thus far. And I guess particularly looking at those section 4 of the report on page 11, we pulled out some of the key findings that the research told us, the emphasis on community being about townships, the fact that wards didn't seem to be a highly significant element in the way that people identify with their location. There was some reflection from a number of people interviewed that belonging, or that sense of belonging to a place, takes some time, and that's relevant for us as we are a rapidly growing district with people moving in from other parts of the region and the wider country. There's an element of engagement as people build relationships and networks within their local communities. That's important, and so that's part of that sense of how people belong to the places where they live. Obviously, that growth is changing communities as well, but also the key issue of local representation, and that's one of the factors that we do have to take into consideration as we set our arrangements in place, with the indication that people do want to be represented by somebody who has a local connection. And we summarised those 3 key steps and suggested now that these are a useful, 3 key themes rather, would be a useful step for us to be thinking about, if you like, a lens through which we can look at the options that are before us and help us to understand which of those are most likely to resonate with people in terms of those themes. The first one of those is that residents identify more with the township that they live in rather than the ward. That local representation is important, but also the research told us that there was no strong desire or mandate for substantial change. So there was the word opinion strongly on either side of the opinion for substantial change, either up or down, in terms of both wards and councillor numbers. So as suggested there, these provide a framework for the committee to refer to when assessing the options and scenarios that are in front of us to be developed for consultation. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any questions from members, comments on this report?
Oh, thanks, Stephen. I mean, what you were saying largely confirmed what we've heard socially out in the community. I don't know what other members heard, but I personally, in the LTP drop-in sessions, there was a strong emphasis on wanting to have someone who was local or understood local issues being elected. They, due to the growth, they were starting to see us as a bit faceless and being a larger organisation. So the community buy-in was having a local face. That's the feedback I was getting.
Q, any other comments, questions?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I agree with Grant. I think consistently through this whole process, we have seen a theme that has come through, which follows on from what Grant said about people identifying that they would like somebody, if possible, to be connected or live in their community so that they have access to them if they want to have access. Now, I don't know whether they use that access. So that, I think, seems to be the thing that comes through. They have spoken about not a lot of appetite for change. They like the ward system, and they like the situation of someone living in their community who they saw represented, and therefore should be connected or should have a better understanding of the local issues, and therefore step up to the table and make that representation. So that, I think, has consistently come through with all our information, and I will be taking those thoughts when I apply them to the maps, which we'll be using, when I will use to either eliminate or support an option.
Yeah, the question I had about them is they want representation from people in their community, but it's what is that community? Because many of our townships, for example, don't have a councillor who lives in or near them. Some have multiple. In the Malvern ward, there's no longer a councillor that lives in Darfield. So the question I would challenge us to consider is, what is that definition of community when they want representation from someone who lives in or understands their community? Does that mean rural versus urban, large township versus small township, lifestyle block versus farm or urban? So it's really our communities of interest are that, and we have a contrasting to results. We have people want to retain the same number of wards, but the research suggested that wards have a little role in identity. So is it that people, as we find in many areas, are simply resistant to change? Does the retention of 4 wards mean that they just don't want change, or does it because they don't actually identify? Many don't identify with wards these days. So those are interesting questions to challenge us. David.
Well, just to add to that comment, I think the other point is that given our significant growth, there is a lot of identity issues at the moment. So people who are new to the district that don't necessarily relate with any ward or particularly any town. So the wards are for electoral purposes only, we must remind ourselves.
Could I just spare an instance which doesn't necessarily apply to the chairman, but contradict that? We were at the coffee afternoon on Monday at Sheffield, and a group is formed in the Sheffield community outside the township committee or township hall, and we won't bother wasting any time as to why that's happened. But they made the comment that they are developing, a Facebook page. They've got a group there, and there are a number of people that live in Sheffield who are very, very new to the community, and they've got a huge desire for what's available. Where can I buy eggs? Where can I, do all that sort of thing. So I think that just supports what David is saying, that there is a lot of diversity and a lot of newbies coming into various parts of the community, and that's great for the community, and that gives them strength. So when you ask them, of course, they don't have history. The people that have probably a passion around wards, but they are still focused on that word community and someone who is potentially related to that community, whether they live in the township or not. And by supporting the ward concept, that gives them the reassurance that there will be somebody elected within that proximity to where they live. That continues to be said.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. I think challenge is the word actually, and I mentioned a couple of times, and our challenges with this, and especially when we're moving ward boundaries around. And one of the things that I guess the report or the questionnaire was light on was Maori engagement, and I've done about this at every single meeting we're in now around engaging wider Maori, not just mana whenua. And I questioned to the chair as to how our policy reflects that. And you don't have to answer that now, but I think at a later date. Obviously, it's a journey for our district, for our people, and we've got a treaty on the wall there that signifies that partnership. So that partnership is between the Maori people and tangata tiriti and tangata whenua. So I think moving forward, there needs to be a focus on wider engagement with all Māori living in the district, as they are also contributors. David, you mentioned the moving of the ward boundaries and the challenges around that, only specifically for election purposes, but I went to a number of Anzac services on Anzac Day, and one of them was actually in Dunsandel. I see we've moved some boundaries around here that sort of traditionally moved away from the Ellesmere district. And I live there, obviously, so I'm passionate about the area or the ward. And I've only lived there for 5 years now. But what I've found is the strong affinity and the dedication, and obviously the commitment and the sacrifice that our people have made over that period of time, including the families. And that's something that I think we haven't considered as we've moved some of these boundaries around, is actually the spiritual significance of these boundaries. So it's something that I've also taken into some of the shortlisting, I guess, that I've done. But over that Anzac Day, in that period, especially in Dunsandel, there was a strong wairua there that, and our young people are representing their tupuna, moving away from the area and never returning home. So I think special consideration should be given to any board changes or boundary changes we give, taking that into account.
We have to remember that even the wholesale district is a relatively new construct. It was created in 1989. That while we talk about belonging and places, this district is just over 30 years old, or 40 years old, 30 years old. And if the government head in the way they seem to be heading, it may not get much older. So that those are great concepts you promote, Shane, but they are reasonably recent constructs. Dunsandel, for example, as I understand it, started in the Malvern ward and became Ellesmere within that last 30 years. So that relationship has changed over time. And we're hamstrung to a certain extent. What we've got to answer is ultimately that ratio of the number of electors per councillor plus or minus 10%. We haven't yet addressed the community board issue, and that's possibly, Stephen, something we need to come back and address, not today, but in a subsequent meeting, is an understanding of whether the recommendation is to go forward with a Malvern community board and or other community boards or no community boards. So yes, people identify with our current board structure, but they are relatively new constructs over time.
Not a good segue, and I'm mindful of time, Mr. Chair, and I just wonder if we're starting to move on to the next item on the agenda, because if we're committing to an outcome to reduce the number at the moment, then I think we're probably at that point.
Any further discussion on this report? If not, would someone like to move? Shane and John. All those in favour? Contrary? Carried. And we move to representation review, the scenarios.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The report has 8 scenario maps attached to it. In discussions with the chair, we also considered 3 adjustments or amendments to some of those maps, and they have been circulated separately. And I'll get Murray to perhaps take us through. Mr. Chair, in your hands, but is it perhaps helpful if we just take these one by one and get some initial comments, and there might be a clear view fairly early on as to which ones we might be able to either tick or omit at this stage. you're happy to take that approach.
Yes. All right.
Thank you. Just some comment. Scenario number 8 is one that you haven't seen before. In the 8 scenarios, 1 to 7 is where these previously been.
Sorry, Murray, when you say 8, is that 511?
That's the 511, yes.
You.
Just thinking about it as well, what we're needing to do is think about fair and effective representation. And the fair representation comes about with the plus or minus 10%. And these scenarios will meet that criteria. So it's now thinking about the effective representation, which is coming about through these communities of interest. If we think about the townships as being where people identify with, then the ward boundaries themselves would be a mixture of townships that actually have something in common. So it's that commonality around that. Obviously, both sides need to be met, the fair and effective, so you can't get outside that 10%. So the adjustment you have to make is around those ward boundaries. You'll see in the report here, we've talked about the 4 wards having a higher degree of community interest. But what that's doing is sort of saying that you're trying to make sure your townships have that commonality about them. So if you have a much wider geographic area, there's a chance you'll have less councillors perhaps being local or seen as local. And also you may run into the potential risk of some townships with not the same commonality being grouped together. So it's just sort of thinking a wee bit about that as we go through these scenarios, is to try and ensure that we, as much as we can, because again we are constrained with the plus or minus 10%, to try and keep that commonality as we go through the process. So I won't talk too long on that, because that was obviously, I thought something just important to understand. And you see that with the 2 ward structure as well. We see that as being a lower degree of local representation, again, because the chance of individuals being elected a long way away from the individual people in the ward could be quite high. So it's using that research around the people like local representation, and they saw that as important, and they saw their townships as being, in some ways, a way of thinking about the community of interest. Yeah. And so, Carol, I'm sorry, perhaps if we want to look at scenario 1, would that be a
Well, we just also have a look at Appendix 1, the plus or minus 10% rule, and so we bear that in mind as we go forward, because it's something we did 6 years ago. We tried to structure it so that the wards where we know growth is going to happen were on the negative scale, and the wards where relatively they won't grow as fast were higher. And as I've personally moved through these scenarios, I've tried to keep that in mind when I'm examining the scenarios, because some of them have a different, those ratios are important. So we can certainly start with scenario 1, which is 410B.
Could I just ask you, Mr. Chair, on that comment you just made, so what is your rating on trying to fulfill that statement you've just made when you're doing your thinking?
It's one of the criteria. I mean, my first cut through these maps is I looked at them as a map and said, does that look right? Does it make sense? Does it address the communities of interest? Are there issues with community interest in the map that I'm looking at? Then I've gone back to the table and said, if this was the scenario that was the outcome, how do the ratios look? Are they the best set? So that's some of my criteria that I've used when I've gone through these maps, is try to balance those two out. If there was a map that looked most sensible, that had the ratios at less than ideal, then I might accept that as a compromise. So that's just an outline of how I have looked at these maps. So we have 2 411s. There's 411B, which Murray's got up on the screen right now. There's also a 411C, which was the result of Stephen and my discussion last week, which moved Hororata back to what is the Malvern ward. based on that our discussion around community's interest, because we didn't see in 411B that Hororata logically would think of itself in Ellesmere. So whilst we can look at 411B, I'd suggest we also at the same time look at 411C, which was one of the later maps, to see if we had to choose one of these two, which of those two would you choose to take forward for further consideration?
Before we move into that, at the last meeting we asked for clarity from staff about the exemption rights or possibility of exemption rights around population. Has that been returned to us?
We're not really in a position to be able to sort of approach the exemption question until we've actually got a proposal on the table. We can then approach the commission and test really when we get to that point.
So I think the reply at that last meeting was that you might informally get a directive that would give us some help, because it was, some of these here certainly would be helped by knowing that there's no chance of an exemption at all. Let's just wipe it off the table. Is that the approach we should take, Murray? That there's absolutely 5% chance of an exemption, and we should therefore play along with the.
At this stage, I can't see any basis that they would provide you with exemption. Normally, it's around isolated communities where you tend to see that coming in. And I've certainly looked at their guidance from the Local Government Commission, and I can't see any basis at this point that you would have. Yep.
So if we're looking at 411B and 411C, are there any other comments?
Yes, if I could just understand, when I apply my theories to the ground, to a reality, and if you look at the map, it doesn't matter which one, that's obviously the little funny guy is Darfield. That one up towards the right of the population to the top of the map, is that Sheffield? Well, the reason for these questions I ask, with Ellesmere going way up there, that doesn't seem to quite fit the communities of interest. It seems to have a long, long tail. Both of these seem to have an incredibly long tail. No disrespect to Ellesmere or anything, but once you've gone on a line from, say, Hororata on the ground and drew a straight line, I think you're stretching it to suggest you've got communities of interest by going way up there.
That's a fair point, but to maintain, one of our bottom lines we started with was maintaining, where possible, 2 councillors per ward. And to get the numbers to work, I understand what you're saying, that effectively the southwestern portion of the current Melbourne ward may not identify with Ellesmere. Is that essentially what you're saying? The area to the south and west of Hororata doesn't traditionally look to Ellesmere?
That's what I'm suggesting. I'm comfortable that Dunsandel is now comfortable with being in the Ellesmere ward, probably halfway up, if you're on the ground, halfway up the Dunsandel Hororata Road, and then I'd suggest you start to struggle, because their natural drift is towards Darfield and shopping and things like that. So once beyond that, it is not their communities of interest.
How do other members feel? Do we rule out both of these maps on that basis for now? I'd say for now, because we can come back and revisit it as we go through. Do other members feel that Ellesmere moving that far north is unreasonable or unlikely or unpopular? I'm not quite sure what word to use. Not suitable? Less acceptable?
It's less acceptable, I would have thought. One of the key questions, and we're not trying to address it now, is if the Melbourne Community Board is kept in existence, the ability to cover large swaths of ground is improved. So potentially Melbourne could be encompassing almost down to State Highway 1, because you have the resources to actually govern it. But if you decide that it's not required, that certainly changes the scope of the ward.
So now put the 411B and C to one side. Okay. The next one, Murray.
Just find the right one here.
Is it 4.7?
410B, this one.
4.10B.
As you can see with 410B, that probably to some degree alleviates that issue that was raised just before. With the boundary much more, it's very similar where it is now. So that one's probably more helpful.
Yeah. The question I had in 410B, it's closer for Ellesmere, Springston. If we were to bring 410B back, Springston is shown in the Ellesmere ward, and that seems wrong. While we had the similar discussion with the rural areas around Hororata feeling they belong to Melbourne, I think the areas Springston and around would feel that they belong in Springs rather than Ellesmere. And similarly, the mesh blocks between Ralston and Burnham would feel that they look to the Selwyn Central ward, not Ellesmere. So there's 3 mesh blocks effectively on the western side of what is a Ralston rather than a Selwyn Central ward. The other issue I had with that very small Selwyn Central ward is that it becomes essentially a single urban ward, and it's hard for those councillors to represent the urban areas as well as rural when they have almost no rural left to represent, particularly as Ralston grows. That's my views on that one. I think it could be, with those issues addressed, it could be one we took forward. Others? Grant, do you feel that Springston would belong in Ellesmere?
No, I believe that at least this paper should be kept for further consideration. What I'm struggling with, Chair, is that probably I would like the committee to give you some feedback first and you summarise rather than you giving your views to the committee first. I don't know if I'm alone in that, but it seems like we're getting quite a chair-centric view here.
Noted. Any other comments?
Well, let's just agree that 410B, we set aside, it's still a live one and just move on. And if through this process we can agree on 1 or 2 that we all agree on, that are either out or in, that's going to be progress, isn't it?
Okay. The next one on the list, Murray, would appear to be 3SB 11B. Oh, 4.7. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Chair, that's 4.7. Again, this one here is probably bringing Melbourne a bit more around. So it's, if you sort of think of the 3 we've looked at so far, we're steadily extending the boundary around on that side that we talked through before.
So that's just, I understand it's 7 councillors, so it's 1, 1, 4, 3, is it? Is that what I'm reading? No, that's not right.
1, 1, 3, 2.
In relation to that, Melbourne would have 1 councillor.
Yep.
Springs Central would have 3. Ellesmere 1. Springs would have 2.
Yep.
So that one doesn't have a minimum of 2 councillors per ward.
Well, I think it should stay in at the moment. On objection for somebody.
I'm in the same view, at least we should give it further consideration.
I agree. I have a concern about the number of councillors, but I think geographically it represents the current communities of interest best. So that one's still in for consideration.
But we're now moving into the 3 ward. Right. So it's 3. I'll show you the right one here for you. 3SE11. This is 3 wards now with Springs and Ellesmere being amalgamated, but again 2 councillors per ward.
And there is a second option of 311C, a printed one that we have circulated today. Just a question on 311C. It's still unclear from the map. Does that include the mesh blocks for Dunsandel in Springs Ellesmere?
Yes, it does. It's basically bringing in that Dunsandel into the Springs Ellesmere one. Okay. That's the fundamental shift that's there on that one.
So, Mr. Chair, if I'm consistent, in my view, I don't feel comfortable with this one because, as I read it, that takes the Melbourne ward all the way down to the sea, doesn't it? And if I'm consistent with my views, I've just expressed my uncomfortableness about Ellesmere. I think the same thing goes for Melbourne. That one doesn't sit, in my opinion, with communities of interest.
Mr. Chair, I tend to agree with John on that one. To me, that would be out.
Okay. Grant?
So 11 and 11C are out.
Okay, 311, both options are out.
So we're just moving to 3 SE10. That is again 3 wards, Springs and Ellesmere amalgamated. Minimum 2 councillors per ward. In this case, 10 councillors. In this case, Melbourne does not come down to the sea.
And we have again an amended one, 310C, which puts Dunsandel back into the combined Springs Ellesmere ward.
Briefly comment on that one too. To bring Dunsandel in, we actually took a bit of a straight line in there. There's actually not a lot of population on that side, but sometimes it's a wee bit arbitrary when you do that. I was trying to avoid, I suppose, large blips across the map. That side of it.
So my vote would be that I sit reasonably comfortable with 3 SE10C. I think it's a better, less change than 3 SE10. I will be promoting that 10C stays in, but 10 does not.
Agreed.
Okay, so 3 SE10C in.
Okay, that leaves us to 3 SE9. Again, Ellesmere amalgamated, 2 councillors per ward. In this case, 9 councillors. And Dunsandel was actually out there in the Melbourne ward.
No.
No.
Okay. It brings us to the 2, is it?
Okay, the 2 ward options.
If at this stage we're offering the widest possible choice, the 2 options offer us the widest possible choice of council numbers. I think it's one that should stay in the mix for now. It's possibly not our preferred, or may not be our preferred final one, but it offers the greatest contrast. And numbers could be played with, as John has indicated, the big northern spread of Ellesmere. Those could be adjusted to look for our next meeting. Pull that north corner of Ellesmere back to Melbourne Central and see what the numbers came out with.
I personally do not like it.
Graham?
Just referencing the community surveys, the outcome I think that people are seeking is a local person of local knowledge. I think the risk of having less wards is that you could end up with a concentration of council laws, particularly around one geographical space, and you might end up with, well, let's just take for example, all the councillors in Lincoln and all the councillors in West Melton or Ralston, which wouldn't give you any geographical representation in the vast hinterland. So although when I started this process I was probably more in favour of this, I'm starting to lean further now on the basis of information received that the ward structure is beneficial. about getting local or town-based representation. So I would vote against the two maps going forward, to be honest.
Okay. Shane? Okay, so the 2 ward option is discarded, and that brings us to 511.
If I may comment just on the 511, what that's doing there is effectively cutting Rolleston on a reasonably arbitrary line at this point in time. One of the issues is that that I see is that you are actually looking there at cutting a community of interest in half. If the views of the community are that the township is their sort of community of interest, then this scenario here is effectively cutting that in half, which is not really what the Commission has in mind when it put out its guidelines.
So through the chair,
Excuse me, John. Councillor Gallagher?
Yes, I agree with those comments. I don't believe we should be splitting Wollaston into. So I'm against this proposal.
John?
through the chair to you, Murray, how does Christchurch overcome that? It overcomes it by suburbs, does it?
Effectively, yes. They would be looking at suburbs and saying, do they have a degree of commonality about them? So therefore, they group together into a ward. But we do know that suburbs will have different interests amongst themselves as well. So it does get a little bit arbitrary, but that's effectively how they've been trying to see that.
Grant.
You finished up. Chair Ginny, on reverse, I think we might be seeing the future here personally, because the exponential growth that we're seeing in the eastern part of Southern is unlikely to decrease. I think when we see the applications in front of us around potential further growth, this tends to lead towards what the future might look like. And realistically, West Melton and Rolleston, they are largely one community of interest. People are very similar, the sporting facilities, the community activities undertaken. Given the scale of the ward, which is getting smaller and smaller all the time to accommodate the representation review, I would suggest that even splitting it in two does retain the community of interest. So I'm leaning towards thinking that this could be a viable option for us in the future.
The other comment I'd like to make is you've got Horata, not on the Melbourne ward, and I don't think that's a good move either.
To my mind, this failed on two areas. The community of interest of the 5th ward splitting Rolleston, I don't think meets the community of interest test. And as Councillor Gallagher has noted, we come back to this argument about the northern spread of Ellesmere way up into the current Melbourne ward and not representing the community of interest up there. So this map, while interesting, fails on those areas. And when I contrast it to the other ward maps we have, particularly 310, 47, we've retained all of Rolleston and West Melton in a single ward, which I think in terms of community interest is where they look now. Historically, West Melton looked to Darfield when their children went to Darfield College, but they don't anymore. They associate far more with Rolleston and or the city than they do to Darfield. So I would, just as we have discarded other maps, I would prefer this one not to be taken forward, because I think it's just the wrong split. If we were able to devise 5 wards that maintain this, then I might be happier, but I don't think we need a new ward. We've got 3 maps so far to retain, that we've agreed to retain, that I think generate a good models, and I don't think this one does. I don't think an arbitrary line down some street in the middle of Rolleston and saying that you're central this side, you're some other ward that side, is actually effective representation. So I would prefer us not to take this model forward.
Question, Mr. Chair, through to Murray. That upper part of Ellesmere, which is what we've talked about, and I've consistently talked about, which goes into Melbourne, which has only got a population of about 400 or 500, it's very lowly populated. If you were to try and take the top off that pointy bit, which might be possible, I think that this is an option that should be put to the community to give them something to think about, even if it's an extreme view. So there's two parts to my question. Is that feasible? Because I think it just doesn't quite look right. And I'm with Councillor Miller. I think this is something that should be considered for the future. Rolleston's going to continue to grow, and at some point you are going to have a ward within the township.
It is certainly something we could work up a bit more and see if we can make it work a bit easier.
Mine might be a voice in the wilderness if it's only one voice.
Yeah. It is something we could work up if that was the design of the
Jane, you have spoken on this one. But, okay, thank you. I'd go back to then, John, your argument also applies to 411C. Well, you rejected 411C because you said Ellesmere took too big a swath out of Melbourne, and now you're saying 511's okay if part of that Ellesmere was returned to it. So I'm suggesting that you're having your cake and eating it to a certain extent here, that if we retain 511, then 411C, by the same arguments, is a valid model that should be in the mix.
Not at all. They're completely different. I've made two statements here and I've been consistent. The Ellesmere ward, it stretches too far up towards the mountains, and I want to take the slice off the top of that to get that. And then I'm supporting this one because it presents wards for Rolleston. That other option does not talk about that. So I don't believe I'm being consistent. Inconsistent.
So if I have a look at 411 and 5, as you were 411B and 511, in fact, the argument is dismissed because the Ellesmere ward in 411B is the same as 511. The other thing too, while Grant is right about this being the future, I don't think the future's here yet. And we know that we've got a number of private plan changes for additional sections to be populated within Rolleston, but that's not going to happen within the time frame that these elections are looking for. And I think when we look at this exercise in 6 years' time, you've already got your model 511. But at the moment, Rolleston sees itself as one town, not two. It's the same argument as Hororata being in Ellesmere or in Melbourne.
Thank you, David, for those comments. I agree. If you're looking at Rolleston as a centre, rather than splitting it in two, make it wider at this stage, and then next time round, if you have to split it in two. I just feel at the moment it's not the right time, even though they're growing. I'd rather have a wider buffer round Rolleston than split it in two.
Okay. Have we any consensus on 511?
I'm out.
I'm not dying in the ditch. I'm quite happy. I agree with what the Chief Executive said. I do agree that Rolleston at this stage looks and thinks itself as one township, so maybe we are a bit early.
Okay. If 511's out, so far I have got 3 maps for us to take forward. 3 SE10C, 47B and 410B, with some questions about a couple of areas for me in 410B.
Question, Mr. Chair, is as a group, is 3 enough options? Are we comfortable? And I think we are. But we're not just going to throw another one in just for the sake of it. Just hold on, because it only confuses a confrontation message anyway.
410B,
But you look at your choices, and the choices that you have in front of you are to retain the current ward scenario, but reduce elected members by one. In some areas, that would be seen as populist. The second scenario is to reduce from 4 electoral wards to 3 electoral wards. So the messaging around there is with respect to communities of interest and the benefits for change. And again, populist in terms of reducing numbers of elected members. The third one, 4.7b, for me is probably the most challenging for the community in terms of areas of representation. So the expectation that we have on our elected member, number one. Number two, the community committee scenario that we're going through at the moment, and I think there'll be some parallel discussions there. And for me, that one probably will be the harder sell. Reducing numbers of elected members, yeah, fine, but we bear in mind that the remuneration pool is the same regardless of whether you got 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and or more. Got 4.10b, 3.SE 10c and 4.7b. I think with each of those, Stephen, I'll get you to add to these comments, but it's around the messaging. So the first message is that because of our significant 2 and 25 elections, the current model can't work. So we need to consider the communities of interest, and we acknowledge the new people who have come into our district. Secondly, we look at the things that we're building and the conversations that we're having, and where is our future strategy for the communities, should I say. And thirdly is around effective representation. How many councillors, how many elected members, etc. do we need to effectively represent the interests of our respective communities?
Thank you. As I said, I just wonder if we come back to the next meeting with a 410C, which would be, so to me, in looking at the mesh block numbers, I can see putting Springston back to the Ellesmere, back to the Springs ward, and the mesh blocks between the reduced Selwyn Central ward and Burnham back into the Central ward, because I think they make certainly the 3 mesh blocks I'm looking at to go back to the Selwyn Central ward have a population of 690. Yeah, 690. So I don't think that's a significant, but in terms of community of interest, they don't look west, they look east to Ralston in those 3 mesh blocks. And I'm sure Springston don't look west either, they look east or north. So members, if we were able to see what effect that had on the numbers for 410 with those adjustments, then I would see that they address both the community of interest concern that I have. I don't know how you feel about that.
Big please, you're going to remove.
I put Springston,
yep,
and the mesh blocks in the immediate area of Springston back to the Springs ward, and the mesh blocks on the left of Ralston, between Ralston and Burnham, which brings up to the old Selwyn Central boundary there, back to Selwyn Central.
What's it going to look like? I don't do the numbers, I can't understand.
Well, that's what I'm suggesting.
What people do for the representation, because if you're going to have a wee play, I would still encourage you to try and take the pointy end of Ellesmere way up that top end.
Yeah, I mean, those are the sorts of comments, the sorts of adjustments that can be made to those maps.
Make sure that you're not such a long thread.
But in the 3 maps we've got,
Sorry.
in the 3 maps we're taking forward,
yep,
there's mostly in the northern end of Ellesmere, in fact, is retained retained either in Ellesmere. In fact, Melbourne comes south in 410, 47 and 3.
That in 4.7b it does not. In 3SE/10C it does, and I'm not advocating that. And in 10b, look, I appreciate that you've got very small populations in that sort of thing and trying to get it to jiggle. But you know, you're the experts. If you're playing around, maybe you can take a pointy end off and still get, you know, around their fringes and still. And when someone comes along and glances at it, they know nothing. They haven't done the research that we've done, and they look at the map and they go, and the first thing they're going to go is, oh, look at that. And if you could just sort of, whereas down around the fringes, the boundary that Mark talks about, the crossover, look, everybody from Ellesmere when they travel go through Springston, virtually. You know, so you can make an argument one way or the other.
So does that leave you with some work, Stephen and Murray, to do for the next meeting, sort of looking at closing in on those mesh block issues for those maps?
Yes, it does, thanks. Just so I'm clear, just taking the last point, the 4.7b has Melbourne sitting down a bit. What we're suggesting is the 4.10, effectively C, also has that same look, isn't it? Is that what we were saying just before? Yeah, so that 10B, it would come to 410C, which is what we'd be adjusting it to. We would actually have that same look as the 4.7B, just so that's consistent. That's what we're saying, isn't it? Yeah.
I didn't even imagine that actually you were coming as low as 10C. I'm giving you a bit of flexibility there.
So we can model those up and see how they look. One of the issues is always the number of population that you're looking to move, and whether we then start exceeding the plus or minus 10 cents. But we can certainly look at that and see what we can do to make that work.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the sort of refinements in these maps that we've chosen to go forward to be within that plus or minus 10% rule, but also address some of the geographical concerns that we see in these maps for our next meeting. Jenny?
Oh, I've just got one question. What is the benefit in the Melbourne ward, right on the right side of the map, of West Melton going into Melbourne? There's just, you've got a little strip there.
Which map are you looking at, Jenny?
Well, it's both 10C and 7B.
Numbers. You're talking about sort of what's effectively the northeastern corner.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's numbers, but
Okay, so that's an area you'd like to see modelled if they were retained in central.
well, yeah. Even though it's going to help the numbers in Melbourne, to me, it's more combining the whole area as a group. I mean, it just sort of doesn't look or feel right there.
Does Stephen and Murray, do you understand what Jenny's talking about?
I do. We do. It's actually a reasonable population balance in that one.
There is a lot of population, is there?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
a good couple of hundred there. So it is relatively sensitive to the numbers. So it's likely to start to reshift everything again, I suspect, looking at that number.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other comments regarding these maps we're taking forward, members? If not, thank you for your work. I think we have to receive the report, and do we formally note in our recommendation that we've recommended that these three maps go forward, or is
For further discussion along with 10C that you've talked about.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, I have one question, and I've asked this question a couple of times already, I believe, whether now's the appropriate time or not, but just understanding what moving the ward boundaries, what effect that has on development contributions.
We can address that in the paper.
Thank you.
Shane. Yep.
I just wondered, Mr. Chair, and you mentioned it at the beginning, at what point as a committee and Councillor Miller talked about it, and we've avoided discussing it where we now address the community board issue.
well, I was going to raise that as well, John. Stephen, I think that's a subject for our next agenda, isn't it? The focus today, John, was to refine the numbers of maps, which we have done successfully. That was the challenge from Grant at the start of the meeting. Our next meeting will be focused on two things. Number one, responding to questions that have been raised, and number two, addressing the community board issue.
Someone like to move the recommendation?
So moved.
All those in favour? Contrary, carried. Thank you, members, for a great engagement today. I think Murray and Stephen now have some clear direction for our next meeting, which will include consideration of the community board option.